there are horror films that unsettle you because of what unfolds on screen, and then there are horror films that leave you uneasy because of what never makes it there. Between the moment a film is finished and the moment it is released, something invisible can take hold. Not a curse, not a controversy, just a sequence of quiet choices, scenes reduced, tones softened, meanings redirected. By the time the film reaches an audience, it may look complete, yet feel strangely hollow. This is not a discussion about extended cuts or rediscovered editions. It's about films whose original forms were never allowed to survive. In these cases, the danger wasn't found in monsters or violence. It was found in atmosphere, in patience, in endings that refused to reassure or explain themselves. Studios intervened, not because the films were broken, but because they were uncomfortable in ways that couldn't be easily marketed. When these films premiered, some directors realized they were watching something unfamiliar. A few publicly rejected the finished version, others quietly distanced themselves, refusing to acknowledge the film at all. What remained were movies that appeared intact but carried the weight of something missing. Each of them existed in two forms, the film that was conceived and the film that was permitted to be seen. Tonight, the question isn't which version works better, it's something far more unsettling. What happens when a horror film loses its original shape and the version that survives is only a substitute for what was meant to exist? These are 15 horror films that were reshaped so aggressively, even their own creators refused to stand by them. Fact 1. Hellraiser, Bloodline 1996. Hellraiser, Bloodline was designed to span centuries and explore horror as inheritance rather than escalation. The original cut reportedly allowed past, present, and future to interweave, creating a cumulative sense of dread. Horror emerged from legacy, not immediate action. The pacing was deliberate, giving weight to the narrative's tragic sweep. Studio intervention dismantled this ambition. The film was heavily recut, sequences removed, and the timeline compressed to meet runtime and franchise demands. Character arcs were flattened, the mythology reduced, and the ending reshaped into something more conventional. Director Kevin Yagher disowned the theatrical release, using a pseudonym for credit. The original cut was never released, and its full scope remains unknown. What survives is a constrained version haunted by the film it was meant to be. Do you want me to continue with the Bond? Fact 2. Don't Look Now, 1973. Don't Look Now was crafted to disorient from start to finish. Early cuts reportedly fractured time and perspective, overlapping emotional states and blending grief with horror in a way that refused clear explanation. The audience was meant to experience confusion, uncertainty, and emotional immersion simultaneously. Editing for clarity changed the effect. Certain sequences were shortened or clarified to reduce viewer confusion. While the final cut remained haunting, it was more navigable than the director's original intention. The earliest assembly, rumored to be harsher, colder, and more punishing, has never been publicly screened. What survives is a masterpiece that hints at a depth of unsettling power still beyond reach. Fact 3. The Wicker Man 1973. Before it became a cult classic, The Wicker Man existed as a ritualistic meditation rather than a conventional story. The earliest cut reportedly allowed songs and sequences to unfold at their own pace. The island's customs were presented as a complete, self-contained culture rather than interruptions for plot. Horror emerged, not from sudden scares, but from inevitability, the outsider gradually becoming enmeshed in a system he could not escape. Distributors found this approach risky. To make the film more marketable, the studio trimmed musical sequences, reordered key scenes, and disrupted the careful rhythm that gave the story its hypnotic pull. The theatrical version remained powerful, but much of the ritualistic tension was lost. Director Robin Hardy later expressed his dissatisfaction, emphasizing that the cut released to audiences did not capture the film's intended atmosphere. Even as longer versions surfaced later, the original structure was never fully restored. Fact 4. The Keep 1983. The Keep was intended to feel ancient and immersive. Michael Mann's original cut reportedly emphasized atmosphere above all else, long shadows, minimal exposition, and a pervasive sense of menace. Story elements emerged gradually, with meaning conveyed through mood rather than narrative clarity. Studio interference proved destructive. Large portions of the film were removed during editing, including critical character development and connective sequences. The score was altered, the pacing was aggressively tightened, what had been a slow descent into myth became abrupt and disjointed. Mann later disowned the theatrical release, asserting that it was not his film. The original cut, rumored to be longer and more immersive, was never released. The keep endures as a cinematic ruin, evocative, mysterious, and incomplete, scarred by what it was forced to lose. Fact 5. Exorcist II, The Heretic, 1977. Exorcist II, The Heretic was initially designed as hypnotic and meditative rather than confrontational. Director John Boorman's original cut reportedly embraced abstraction, repetition, and dream logic. Possession was intended as a psychological echo rather than a spectacle. The film was meant to unsettle quietly, allowing viewers to drift in disorientation. That vision was dismantled. After disastrous test screenings, scenes were removed, and the structure was heavily reworked. Ambiguity was replaced with explanation. The tone was flattened into something more conventional and literal. Boorman later acknowledged that the released version bore little resemblance to his original vision. The early cut, described as strange, alien, and unsettling, has never been publicly shown. What survives is a fractured film, haunted by a version deemed too unconventional to exist. Fact 6. Event Horizon, 1997. Event Horizon was originally conceived as a film that suffocated rather than shocked. Early cuts reportedly emphasized psychological terror and existential dread. Long sequences were designed to disorient and trap the audience alongside the crew. Violence existed, but it was secondary. The true horror came from implication, the notion that the ship had traversed beyond human comprehension and returned with something irreversibly wrong. This subtlety did not survive. Post-production edits were extensive. Test screenings labeled the film confusing and overwhelmingly bleak. Entire sequences, including explorations of the ship's previous crew, were removed. The pacing was tightened, the narrative clarified, and the emphasis shifted toward visceral horror. Director Paul W.S. Anderson later admitted that the theatrical version was a compromise. The darkest material, he suggested, was likely destroyed, making restoration impossible. The film that remains is intense but incomplete. Fact 7. The Fog, 1980. Before it was reshaped, The Fog relied on anticipation rather than shock. The earliest cut leaned heavily into atmosphere, empty streets, distant sounds, and prolonged stretches where nothing occurred except the slow advance of mist. The threat was environmental, almost abstract, arriving without urgency or explanation. Test screenings altered the course of the film. Audience reactions prompted extensive re-editing. New scenes were added to heighten impact. Shock moments were introduced. The pacing was tightened to provide clearer surges of tension, reducing the film's dependence on suggestion. John Carpenter has openly acknowledged these changes, noting that the released version was shaped by audience response. While he later accepted the final cut, he has also implied that something quieter and more unsettling was lost. What remains is a film remembered for its atmosphere, yet haunted by the possibility that its original version allowed the fog to arrive even more slowly and far less forgivingly. Do you want me to continue with Fact 6-4? Fact 8. Burnt Offerings, 1976. Burnt Offerings was initially shaped as a slow study in depletion. The earliest cut reportedly lingered on subtle transformations, changes in tone, behavior, and intimacy, rather than overt menace. The house was not meant to strike or threaten. It was meant to absorb, quietly feeding on warmth and presence while offering comfort in return. That approach was diluted in the edit. Concerns over repetition and pacing led to significant trimming. Scenes that existed primarily to build psychological unease were shortened or removed. The influence of the house became more explicit, more readable, and less insidious. Director Dan Curtis later suggested that the theatrical cut lost some of its intended density. What remained worked effectively, but revealed too much too soon. There are long-standing claims that an earlier version made the house feel less like a haunted structure and more like a living exchange, something that consumed slowly and without warning. That cut has never surfaced, leaving only traces of its original intent. Fact 9. The Changeling, 1980. In its earliest incarnation, The Changeling was structured around loss rather than fear. The original edit reportedly allowed grief to dominate the film's rhythm. Silence was not a pause, it was a presence. Scenes were permitted to linger well beyond comfort, forcing the audience to remain inside mourning before the supernatural ever revealed itself. The haunting was meant to feel patient, as though the house was responding to sorrow rather than creating it. That stillness was questioned. During post-production, pressure mounted to accelerate the pace, pauses were reduced, the ghostly elements were introduced more clearly and more quickly. The edit subtly redirected the film away from introspection and toward a more conventional haunting. Narrative. Director Peter Medak later acknowledged that the released version moved faster than he had originally intended. The film remained powerful, but some of its emotional suffocation was softened. Those involved in early cuts have suggested that the first version allowed grief to overwhelm the story completely, making the supernatural feel inseparable from loss itself. That version has never been publicly screened, leaving behind a film whose quietest moments may have been its most devastating. Fact 10. The Sentinel, 1977. At its core, the Sentinel was meant to observe rather than attack. The earliest cut reportedly treated its setting with restraint, allowing the building itself to feel watchful and patient. Scenes lingered in silence. The horror emerged slowly, as if the space were waiting rather than threatening. That patience did not survive post-production. Editorial changes pushed the film toward immediacy. Shocking imagery was foregrounded. Subtle connective moments were reduced. The rhythm shifted from sustained unease to abrupt intrusion, trading atmosphere for impact. Director Michael Winner later expressed dissatisfaction with the final version, suggesting that the balance between mood and spectacle had been lost. The film remained striking but fractured. Those close to the production have claimed that earlier versions felt far more suffocating, less eager to explain themselves. That cut has never been released, leaving the Sentinel suspended between the film it became and the one it was never allowed to remain. Fact 11. The Possessed, 1977. The Possessed did not begin as a film about spectacle. Its original construction reportedly focused on psychological erosion rather than overt possession. Faith weakened gradually. Identity blurred. The audience was meant to question whether anything supernatural was occurring at all, or whether the horror was unfolding entirely within the mind. That uncertainty was not preserved. Post-production changes pushed the film toward definition. Ambiguous moments were clarified, explanations were added, the pacing shifted to emphasize visible disturbance instead of internal collapse. What had once been a slow unraveling became something more recognizable and far less disturbing. The director later rejected the theatrical cut outright, stating that it no longer represented the film he had made. The released version, he argued, replaced internal terror with surface shock. Rumors continue to circulate of a darker, more restrained assembly that allowed doubt to dominate every frame. Whether it was dismantled or simply forgotten remains unclear. What survives feels incomplete, marked by the absence of its most essential ideas. Fact 12. The Incubus, 1982. From the outset, the Incubus was conceived as something corrosive rather than confrontational. Early assemblies reportedly allowed unease to spread quietly. The film relied on implication, disturbing glances, fragmented dialogue, and the sense that moral decay had already settled in long before anything supernatural appeared. Evil was not meant to announce itself. It was meant to linger, unanswered. That restraint alarmed the studio. During post-production, the edit began to favor clarity over discomfort. Abstract moments were shortened, transitions were tightened, silence was treated as excess. The film was reshaped into something more literal, more easily categorized, and ultimately less unsettling. Director John Huff later distanced himself from the theatrical version, noting that its atmosphere had been compromised. What remained still hinted at something darker beneath the surface, but it no longer trusted ambiguity to carry the weight. There are persistent accounts of an earlier cut that leaned far more heavily into moral corrosion, where the Incubus felt less like an enemy to confront and more like a presence that could never truly be removed. If that version exists, it has never been seen. Fact 13. The Curse, 1987. From its inception, The Curse was meant to feel contaminated. Early cuts reportedly emphasized slow decay of land, of family, of sanity. Influenced by Lovecraftian themes, the film treated horror as an invasive force that could not be confronted or explained, only endured. Its pacing was deliberate, its tone oppressive. That vision was deemed impractical. Post-production shifted the emphasis toward immediacy. The edit accelerated the rhythm, favoring explicit effects and clearer horror beats. Subtle dread was replaced with visible transformation, breaking the sense of inevitability that once defined the story. Director David Keith later expressed dissatisfaction with the final version, suggesting it no longer carried the existential weight he intended. The film that reached audiences felt more familiar and less disturbing. Those involved have claimed that earlier versions were far bleaker, allowing corruption to unfold without relief. If such cuts survive, they remain hidden, leaving the curse suspended between what it was meant to be and what it was allowed to become. Fact 14. The Awakening, 1980. The Awakening was originally designed to disturb without announcing itself. In its earliest form, the film reportedly embraced distance and ambiguity. Supernatural elements were meant to remain just out of reach, allowing tension to build through suggestion rather than revelation. The horror was rooted in the idea that something ancient was stirring. Long before it became visible, that subtlety did not survive the edit. Studio intervention pushed the film toward clarity and pace. Scenes that existed only to cultivate unease were trimmed back. The structure was streamlined, and the ending adjusted to feel more decisive. What had once lingered was brought to a conclusion. Director Mike Newell later acknowledged that the theatrical cut diverged sharply from his original vision. The released version was coherent and accessible, but far less haunting. What remains is a film that gestures toward something deeper, as though the true terror is still present but permanently out of reach. Fact 15. Ghost Story 1981. When Ghost Story arrived in theaters, it already carried the weight of something unresolved. Early versions of the film reportedly leaned into restraint. Fear was allowed to develop through memory, regret, and silence rather than spectacle. Conversations lingered. Guilt pressed down on the characters slowly, giving the impression that the past was not merely haunting them but judging them. The horror was designed to settle in quietly and refuse to leave. That approach made the studio uneasy. During post-production, the film was reshaped for momentum. Scenes built purely on atmosphere were shortened or removed. Explanations were moved closer to the surface. The edit tightened the rhythm, easing the pressure that had once been central to the experience. Director John Irvin later suggested that the released version no longer reflected the film he intended to make. While the final cut retained elegance, its suffocating dread had been interrupted. There have long been rumors of an earlier assembly that leaned far more heavily on mood and moral reckoning, one that treated the story less as a ghost tale and more as a confrontation with buried sin. If that version still exists, it has never been made public. Bonus: The Exorcist III wasn't altered because it wasn't frightening enough. It was altered because it asked the wrong questions. What if evil doesn't need to shout? What if faith collapses in silence? What if horror comes from certainty, not chaos? Those questions were cut away, but they never stopped haunting the film. If the original version had been released as intended, would audiences have accepted it or rejected it all over again? Tell us what you think.